Welcome everyone to Sidebar with Judge Dan Winslow. This week's episode is going to be really interesting conversation with a lawyer who has expertise in many areas, including mental health law. But before we kick that off and introduce you to our guest, just a couple of things by way of preliminary introduction. By the way, thank you for those of you in our studio audience joining us here today. First of all, this is a legal show, but it's not legal advice. So if you need legal advice, by all means, Ann Stevenson, I happen to know, gives competent legal advice. But please just take this as our opinions, not even necessarily the opinions of the New England Legal Foundation or our respective employers, but our own personal opinions for purposes of today's show. And if you do need legal advice, of course, we urge you to seek the advice of counsel. If you're new to the Sidebar app, couple of sort of things to orient you. In the lower, if you have an Apple device, in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see an equal sign. And if you want to join us on stage and ask a question at any point in the conversation, we welcome that. This is intended to be an interactive conversation with the audience as well as our guest. So feel free to just click on that equal sign and I will get to you. I'll let you know that I'm going to get to you and invite you on to the stage to ask your question. And then we'll nicely kick you off the stage after you've had a chance to ask your question so we can make room for other folks. And then on the lower right-hand side of your screen, you'll see an emoji button. And if you click on that emoji button, you'll see a range of emojis from happy to sad to indifferent. And then if you click on the emoji, you could actually add a chat to the chat box and then hit send. And that will actually send the written question to us. If you're too shy about getting on stage with us, we'll still ask your question and work it into the conversation. In fact, why don't we try that just to practice a little bit? If you could click on that emoji button and just click on the applause and hit send. It's pretty tepid, everybody. Let's try. Okay, a little bit better. Okay, I'll take it. Okay, that's enough. Now you're embarrassing me. I always like to start off the show with a round of applause because it sets the expectations. So, speaking of high expectations, I want to introduce you to our guest today. Ann Stevenson is a lawyer in Massachusetts. She has her own practice, the law offices of Ann Stevenson, and she does a range of things. But the thing that I'd like to focus on today is mental health. And Ann, I just thought I think you're off mute now. If you're off mute, if you could just take a moment to introduce yourself to the audience and to just share a little bit about your practice.
Thank you very much for having me on, Judge Winslow. I appreciate that. So my name is Ann Stevenson, and I am an attorney my practice is out of Marblehead, and I'm a court-appointed attorney for persons for people who have criminal law issues, juvenile law issues, and mental health law. And I also do appellate law as well. So.
That's great. And Marblehead, for those of you who are not from Massachusetts, is north of Boston, beautiful community where, shockingly, apparently they have crime. And so there must be business up there. So,
well, it's all over the North Shore. So I'm often in different courts, depending on what they need.
Fantastic. Well, we're thrilled to have you on with us and thrilled to have your expertise that you bring on this topic as well. And I want to welcome Emma and Ann. Thank you for joining us, Ann, and Elisa. Nice to see you again. And so a number of folks in the audience here today. So I have Ann with an E, which is you, Ann, and then Ann without an E. So we're happy to have both Anns, both versions of Anns here on the show with us today. So I want to just sort of set the scene, Ann Stevenson, about COVID sort of as an underlying catalyst for revealing some of the shortfalls, the failings of our mental health system. And you're on the front lines of this, so I'm really interested in your perspective. But as I understand it, we're all aware of a lot of the medical consequences of COVID, but there's also a host of mental health consequences of COVID as well. I mean, the stress of COVID is certainly taking its toll. People that have been isolated, people who've lost family or friends. It's been devastating. Over 1 million people in the United States, for example, as affected by this. But what it has done is it has revealed, I think, some of the failings of our mental health system as well, because it was tough going ahead of time, but when you sort of add in this additional burden, this additional layer of need, it seems that what was being held together by chewing gum and baling wire has reached in many cases a breaking point. And I know that you're a Massachusetts practitioner. We like to think that we have it better here than most states, but I'm sure that there's lessons even to be learned here in Massachusetts that could be even helpful outside of this state. And there are people that watch this show from other states as well. So just if you could just orient us for how the mental health system works in Massachusetts, in terms of the availability of treatment. Hey, Frankie J., great to see you, and thanks for joining us today. So how does the mental health system work in Massachusetts from your point of view, just mechanically? If somebody's having a moment of crisis, what are the resources? Just walk us through that to sort of set the scene, if you could.
Okay, so when I practice mental health law, and I am appointed onto cases where a person is being held against their will by a hospital because they are a danger to themselves or others by reason of their mental health. And the way that system starts out is the person will be, the hospital, they'll walk into an ER, and the hospital will screen them, do a mental health screening. And if they meet criteria for what's called a Section 12 hold,
and that's the statute. That's the Massachusetts statute involved.
Yeah, I think the hospital has the legal right to hold the person against their will. And what they do is they transfer that person from the ER to a Department of Mental Health licensed psychiatric unit, which is locked. And they evaluate that person for 72 hours to see if they pose an imminent danger to themselves or others, or if they can just be patched up and sent to the community.
So I'm going to ask you, though, just before we get too far, so you said if somebody walks into an emergency room, this is the power of the hospital. What if somebody's not walking into the emergency room? What if, if somebody's on the street, they're presenting in a way that causes other people, police or bystanders, to think that they are a danger to themselves or others? Is that another path to get into the system?
Yeah. So I often have clients who have family members that are concerned about their loved one's mental health and the behaviors that they're seeing at home, and they're fearful for themselves or their loved one. So we get those calls, or there's often times when the police will get involved. They're in the community exhibiting either odd behavior that leads a police officer to believe that they're a danger to themselves or others, or they're committing some crime where they're not able to be sent to jail until arraignment because they're in need of acute treatment. Mm-hmm. So those are the types of cases that I started looking at.
Okay, and so somebody would then come into the system that way. Either they self-admit into an emergency room at a hospital, or the police or family members could call them to the attention of either the police or a hospital. Do people get scooped anymore off the street, or do they actually have to go in? Can people be arrested for a mental health warrant in Massachusetts?
You cannot be arrested. It's a hold.
A hold? Well, can you be held? Like you're walking down Main Street. Can somebody just come up and like the sort of the stereotypical men in the white suits come and take you away? Does that happen any longer?
No, there's only certain people who can affect holds, and that's going to be doctors, I believe nurses, I know police, EMTs. As psychiatrists, they can affect a mental health hold in Massachusetts. Okay. I can't speak for other states.
Either the criminal justice system through the police or the medical system through doctors, nurses, or EMTs.
And there are also times when I have clients who were in jail and they break down and they end up on mental health holds in ERs.
Okay, and the key is for this system is not mental illness as an illness, but rather mental illness as a reason to believe that somebody is a risk of harm to themselves or others. The fact that somebody's mentally ill is not a reason to impose treatment, is it? Or is that they have to have that additional predicate?
It has to have that element of harm or inability to care for oneself. because there's lots of people, we don't speak enough about the value of neurodiversity and that we need these quirky people in the world to come up with brilliant ideas. But it only becomes a problem when somebody it is an imminent harm to themselves or society. So that's the threshold. And if, that's the threshold that we work on.
Yeah, hey, Frankie J., I just want to let you know, Ann is speaking from the perspective of Massachusetts, but we welcome different states' experiences. So in New York, for example, where your experience might be, or other states, by all means, feel free to join us on stage if you'd like. And there you are. So, Frankie, tell us about New York. How does New York differ from what Ann's described here in Massachusetts?
Well, at least from my experiences here in New York, it depends on each situation, of course, everyone being different. And if the police are on site and certain words are said, if the people say the words "I want to die" or "I've thought of killing myself," et cetera, they're automatically 5150. They're taken right down to the county hospital, held for 72 hours, and then they go through a CPAP process where they're interviewed, see where they're at to determine if they're going to be admitted. And the police can randomly, if they see somebody acting away in public, can do a stop and do obviously an interview they deem appropriate, and they can 5150 anybody at any time.
So 5150 is the New York version of what Massachusetts calls Section 12, it sounds like. I'm curious to Ann's point, Frankie. I'd be interested in your perspective on this. What Ann was saying is that under the law in Massachusetts, the person by reason of mental illness has to cause someone, a police officer or a medical provider, to be concerned for their fear that they would be a risk for themselves or others for their safety, an ability to care for themselves, a risk of harm to themselves or others. But that simply having mental illness, that what Ann's described as neurodiversity, that the everybody's different, and maybe that's not a bad thing. I'm curious, in New York, in your experience, what is it the same thing? It's limited to safety issues in New York?
It's just kind of like turn them and burn them, as you would say in the restaurant business. You try to get them in, try to get them out, and in the middle there somewhere trying to fix them, which usually recidivism of these people going back and being frequent flyers is high. But I think if they were to not treat it that way, meaning diagnose them properly, I think, Judge, a lot of this is neurological, and it's not being tested for neurological. It's being implemented as psychiatric, and when it's psychiatric, then that's when the meds come in, where there are other methods that are invasive or holistic for the treatment of neurological issues. So I got mixed emotions on the entire subject, but the way it is here in New York, yeah, you can go based on a few words you say, the way you're behaving, and nobody has to necessarily call on you or have concern for you.
I just want to be clear with my answer that the person has to be acutely mentally ill. It can't be a harm that might result in a year or even a month. It has to be within a set, like an imminent harm. Like, you have to be able to say, if we release them and they stop taking their meds, then what will happen is they'll decompensate in a matter of hours and they'll kill themselves. You have to be able to
say it's acute, some sort of an imminent risk. It's not just the risk, but the risk has to be imminent. Hey, Jason, thanks for joining us in the audience today. You're welcome to join us with any questions or points you'd like to share as well. So, and you talked about how the process should work, and what the limitations of the process are in terms of what the triggers might be, imminent risk of harm to oneself or others. As somebody who's actually in this space, how does it work? How does it in fact work?
I would agree with the previous guest's assessment
Frankie,
that it is a turn and burn operation, because the units that we have in these hospitals, they're short term. They're meant to patch you up and send you out into society with a new group of meds or whatever it takes to get you set up so that you're no longer that imminent threat of harm to yourself or others. But they're not for long-term sustainable treatment. Like you don't go back in most of the units. You're not going to go back and see them on the day to day. They're going to set you up with some provider in the community.
So almost isn't it? Hey, Jason, I'm going to invite you up on the stage here. Jason, welcome. Thanks for joining us on stage. What's your question or your point?
The point I would like to make, I mean, if you go back into the 80s during the Reagan administration, they cut mental health funding for a reason. And when you released all these mental health people, it created a huge epidemic of resources. And then I'm not trying to get political, but when
Jason, I think, yeah, you there?
Yeah, I know
can you hear me?
exactly what
Oh,
he's
yeah, hang on a
talking
second.
about.
And Jason just cut out for 1 second. Jason, you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, we can. Yep, go ahead. And so you're starting to say about the epidemic, and then I lost you.
Okay, so what I'll basically say is, and I'll really keep it brief, is that our social engineering within our communities, not to be over political, goes hand in hand with mental health. And if you don't have funding for one, it's not just saying I'm just trying to treat people, but I'm trying to help prepare people within society, because you look at neurodiversity is being confused necessarily with mental health. Neurodiversity means your processor, like I have Asperger's. I'm a functional, person with a form of attention deficit disorder. But
Right.
you combine that with somebody who is schizophrenic, then guess what's going to happen? If they're not on their meds, they could be a danger to others. And then the
Right.
state or the community wants. So I think that social engineering and social advocacy and social workers need to be looked at in such a way where they're trained with mental health to help coordinate these people for continued, not so much care or supervision, but growth. And that's what I want to say.
So that's great. Hey, Jason, I appreciate you joining us. Hey, Ann, I just muted your microphone. We're getting some feedback on that, so unmute yourself when you want to talk again. But Jason, thanks for joining us on stage, and thanks for making that point. Just to follow up on that point, Jason was referring to this social engineering of mainstreaming for mental health, which in concept of taking folks from mental hospitals, inpatient care into community-based care, in theory, sounded great. But there's not a constituency, it seems, for the political process in mental health because, the funding wasn't there. And so instead of mainstreaming people, we main streeted them. And what we've seen, in fact, is a number of people, homeless people in our prisons, 70% of our prisons are people that have underlying mental illness. We've effectively shut down inpatient hospitals and opened up prison beds instead, which seems to be a very expensive way to spend money. Yeah, Ann, what do you say about that?
So what I wanted to say is, would it be more efficient to save questions for later in the show, because then we can, but one of the things that I want to say is that I do see that, and I do work a lot in prisons and I work at Bridgewater State Hospital, which with persons who have been convicted or are awaiting trial. And it is difficult to get people treatment in the community, but what my unit at the Committee for Public Counsel Services does is that we often bring things up on appeal. And one of the issues that we've addressed through case law is that you can't hold somebody exclusively because they're homeless. That doesn't indicate that they're in imminent danger. It's usually the people that are being held. I would say probably 90% of my clients are in psychosis, and they've made a statement like, I'm going to kill myself or others, or they have a history of that, or they're somehow putting themselves at risk in the community. So it's one thing if you're homeless and you're used to being homeless and you're mentally ill and you know how to take care of yourself and you're street savvy. It's quite another thing when you suddenly go into psychosis and people are beating you up and robbing you and you're putting yourself at risk because you don't know where to go or how to get into shelters. And those are the people that we're supposed to be worrying about for that reason. Since COVID, I won Lawyer of the Year a few years ago, and one of the reasons was that when the pandemic first started and everybody was afraid to go into the hospitals, I was like, I needed to go in because I love my clients. I think they're amazing people usually. They're fabulous clients. And I worried because I wanted to know what the conditions were. So, well, everybody inside these units. So what I was doing is I was going into the hospital units to see my clients and observe the conditions that they were living under, because it was true. And at some of these units that I was going to, they didn't have PPE. They weren't testing for COVID. They weren't handing out masks. They had people still stacked up in rooms, 4 people deep in a bunk bed situation. And that even now isn't acceptable, but it still happens. But if there's nobody there to report. And so we started bringing some of these cases up and filing motions saying, you need to protect this client. But one of the changes that I saw at the beginning of the pandemic was people coming in who had no history of mental illness, who were in full-blown psychosis, who were not symptomatic with COVID, but they tested positive in the emergency room. And so I'm not a doctor, and there wasn't, there aren't really COVID specialists even now because COVID is a new disease. And so they weren't really linking that up at the time, but they have started linking that up now to the admissions. And there are, when you started the show, you brought this up. And I just want to give some statistics on that because I did do the research. So about everybody who gets COVID, whether they're symptomatic, we tend to think of COVID as a disease that is only related to lungs. Like maybe it's a cold or a flu, and supposedly, in the beginning, we were looking at it like it could only be a serious COVID case if you were hospitalized, or if you were on a ventilator, or if you died. But we now know that should not be the barometer for what is serious COVID, because 30% of the people who get COVID, even those who are asymptomatic, end up with long COVID. And long COVID is much more serious. And there was a study that came out this week that said the more times you get COVID, the more chances of injury you get. And one of the good quotes that I liked was from David Nabarro from the World Health Organization. He was interviewed this week by Sky News, and he said, the more times you get COVID, the more likely you are to be unlucky and end up with long COVID, which is the thing that nobody wants because it's so serious. And long COVID, people don't think of it this way, but if you look at any of the long COVID clinics that are popping up, what you're going to see is that they're screening for cognitive abnormalities like cognitive impairment, attention and word finding difficulties, executive dysfunction, memory loss, and insomnia, depression, and anxiety. And there are other symptoms that have come out. So there was a study from Oxford which said people with even mild COVID are having brain damage. So you have it was a study done out of England where they took people where they happened to have MRIs on hand from before COVID. And then they scanned those same people after COVID. And the people who had COVID, probably, I think they said about 70% had brain lesions and at least 2% volume loss in your brain. And so depending on where those lesions are, it is going to affect your executive functioning. There was another study that was done in the Netherlands by the Employee Insurance Agency, which is like the Department of Unemployment Insurance here. So when you apply for unemployment or disability, you go through this office. And so they polled the people that were on disability in the Netherlands. And what they found was that half the people who had long COVID were declared unfit to work. 85% were getting long-term disability benefits, and 62% of those people could not work at all. Some other things that I thought were interesting was that, Survivor Corps, which is an organization for people with long COVID who are looking for solutions, they're overwhelmingly focused on mental health because they did a poll of their members, and 88% of those who had long COVID had experienced some form of mood or emotional disorder since getting COVID. And 50% of them had had suicidal ideation, which is a huge, huge difference from somebody who gets the flu, where there's no connection between those things. And these are people who are suicidal because the COVID has affected their brain, but there are also, a lot of them have chronic pain and they have no solutions because there really isn't any cure for these things that we're looking at. So, and the other thing that is important to remember is that there was another study that was done that I was reading this week, and it said that if you have long COVID, then you also have a 3.5 times more likely to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's, 2.5% more, or 2.5 times more to be diagnosed with Parkinson's, 2.5% more for stroke, and 4.5 times more likely to have bleeding on your brain. So these are all things that are going to affect your mental health and your functioning, your cognitive functioning.
So, Anne, you said something. Hey, Anne, would you mind muting when I'm getting some feedback through your audio there? The thing that you just said to me that was among many things that were disturbing, but I just want to follow up on this one is, I've had COVID. A lot of people have had COVID, and so my attitude was, that wasn't so bad. I was lucky I had a mild case. I'm not to minimize the impact that it's had on so many people, obviously, but in my own case, I was like, well, I've had worse flus than that. But what you just said is that there's about a 30% chance of getting long COVID, these larger, longer cognitive symptoms. And the statement that you just made is, and the more times you have COVID, if you get it again, your chances of having long COVID go up, which stands to reason. Obviously, you've got about a 30% chance every time you get COVID. So that's alarming. What's also alarming to me, and Jason has made this point, Frankie's made this point as well as you, Anne, what we have is this almost like a patch system. I think I can't remember whether it's Frankie or Jason called it the turn and burn or churn and burn thing, which is, we take somebody who's in an acute situation for mental health, we bring them in, we get them stabilized, and then they're done. And that creates this larger question. And I'll be really curious for you as a lawyer that practices in individual rights, because you have clients, obviously, that represent their interests. Where's the line between privacy, the person's right to live their life as they see fit, and the need to have longer term care, which they may not recognize or appreciate that they even need? We've seen many times people who are under treatment, they become asymptomatic and then they stop taking their meds, even though the meds seem to work, and then they decompensate again. I'm curious about that next stage.
So what happens is the hospital holding that person can file what's called a civil commitment action, and it's not a criminal action. It goes, in Massachusetts, it goes to the district court, and the hospital has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the person is an imminent risk to themselves, of harm to themselves or others, or that they would, if they were released into the community, that they would be an imminent risk. And at that point, if the hospital is able to meet their burden, then the person can be held for up to 6 months the first time, and the commitment can be renewed with a retrial for a period of a year after. There's a separate portion of it that goes towards medications, which is known here as a Rogers order, an order for forced medication. There really isn't a way to force somebody to take medication in Massachusetts unless it's injected. But most of the medications we're talking about wouldn't be injected. So even if you were to do this, but they're not going to release that person until the hospital will not release that person after a civil commitment. until they feel that the person's no longer a danger to themselves or others.
So it's interesting though, and I take your point that you made earlier about the neurodiversity, and I'm just gonna mute you for a sec because I'm getting some feedback. Let's see here. Mute. Okay. I just muted you. So I take your point about neurodiversity, but sort of what's the threshold of danger to oneself or others? For example, in Boston, it gets really cold here in the wintertime, and there are people who are sleeping in doorways in 5-degree weather. It can't be healthy, and yet they're not. They're homeless, but they're also not capable of taking care of themselves for any number of reasons. Is that a reason to scoop people and put them into the mental health system, or are these people just lost? That is, the system overlooks them. There's not sort of that interim or that intermediate level of care for people that are well enough, they're diverse, but they need help. I'm just curious about your experience with that.
Well, I think what you're missing is there has to be a direct nexus between their mental health. Like, Dan, there's no other conditions under which the state can hold you if you're not under arrest. So if you walk into the emergency room, they can't force any treatment on you, and they can't force you to be evaluated at that thing. Even if you walk into the emergency room and you've been shot in the head, and they know that you're going to die within X amount of, they can't hold you in that hospital if you say, you know what, I think I'm going to walk up the street to another place. If you have a broken leg, you can walk right out of the hospital.
Well, you could walk, but you could hop.
Yeah, you could crawl out. You could do whatever you wanted. You have the liberty to make that decision because you're making it with a fully competent mind. It doesn't matter if it's a bad decision, it's your decision. You're allowed to make bad medical decisions for yourself. But once you lose your competence, your mental competence, that's a different thing. That they can hold you for that. And they can't necessarily force you to have the medical treatment, but they can certainly expedite the process for getting you mental health treatment and commitment if necessary in order to impose that treatment on you so that you can make a sound medical decision.
So this leaving against medical advice for medical treatment, but if it's a mental health acute situation, you can be helped. Is your point?
Yes.
And I'm just curious about the longer term implications. I get what Frankie and Jason will describe as turn and burn kind of thing, but what are the resources available for people that need and want mental health assistance? They don't want to risk being, locked up in an inpatient ward.
I see that a lot. You see a lot of people who are treatment resistant, who have had bad experiences, and they have very good reasons for not wanting treatment. Like they may have been on medications that gave them side effects. One of the biggest side effects I see is when you have sexual dysfunction, you're tired all the time, so you can't work as much, your head might be cloudy, and your doctor isn't responding appropriately. And that's what I usually see, where people don't want to be on medication. There's also some people, I think I talked to you about this earlier, is that they just don't believe in psychiatric drugs, even if they need them. And I try to talk to my clients because I'm not a doctor, but it does stand to reason that, every organ in your body can get sick. It's possible, but we would never say to somebody who has diabetes, you shouldn't take that insulin because you can walk it off. Mm-hmm. But if somebody's brain is affected by something like long COVID, they need to get treatment, or they have a mental illness that's affecting their brain. They need to get treatment, and it shouldn't be a matter of shame. It should be a matter of, we should be encouraging that without shame, because it's normal, because everybody struggles at some time in their life,
Yeah,
that's
it'd be admirable if they did. How do you overcome that culturally? How do you overcome that then? If is it just by talking about it, making it not a hidden topic, but something that's more transparent?
The way I see hospitals doing it, because again, I can only give them their legal options. I can't I can't give medical advice. I see hospitals trying to make the person, to educate them about, hey, remember what your quality of life was before. Remember all the times that you were doing well, or do you remember if the voices in your head stopped when you were taking the medication? Did you still hear them? Those types of things, to encourage people to make the decision on their own, to actively participate in their own treatment, because they're more likely to be treatment compliant if they agree with the treatment rather than if it's being forced on them. But again, it also depends on providers, because we don't have a lot of providers in the community, which is why we have so many people lining up in emergency rooms. And then, as I said, with the long COVID issue, if 30% of our workforce has long COVID, that's affecting the hospital staff, because they were the frontline responders who most likely were, and we're seeing staffing shortages across the board from that. So
Curious. I'm curious, Anne, about what's next. Like, if you could wave a magic wand, you've had the perspective of being in the trenches. I just muted your microphone because of feedback. But if you're in the trenches and you've seen it, you've represented people who are involved in the mental health system, both in the acute phase and I presume longer in the Rogers hearings, the forced medication hearings. If you could just wave a magic wand, a policy magic wand, and change things, what kinds of things would you encourage to be considered or to be done? And I'm sorry, I did mute you, so you have to unmute yourself.
I think the original intent of the Massachusetts legislature in releasing, or I think it was Governor Weld, in releasing people, in shutting down the long-term mental health facilities, was that they really weren't getting help. They were just being warehoused and hidden, like people were ashamed of people who had mental illness. But that was a long time ago. That was in the 70s and 80s. And those institutions shut down. I think we do need more community resources for people to turn to. But one of the things that would be really helpful is, I took a case up to the Massachusetts, a case that I tried on the district court level was the CPCS appellate unit took it up to the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts, which is the highest court in Massachusetts, because I had a client who was held for more than 10 days in the ER. And the statute for how long you can hold somebody in the ER before you transfer them, it doesn't say how long you can hold somebody. So it's before you have them evaluated on the unit, because once you get on the unit, you have 72 business hours to evaluate that person, and the doctor has to decide whether they're an imminent threat to themselves or others. But what's happening now is that there's no community resources. So instead of being able to just go to your treating psychiatrist or clinician, people are going to the emergency room, and they're being held in the emergency room. And what the Supreme Judicial Court said in that case, it was Justice Kafker. He said, the hospitals know best. You can have an indefinite hold on liberty in an ER just for this one specific subset, because what if somebody gets released into the community? Most people with mental illness, there's no greater prevalence of persons with mental illness being violent or suicidal than any other person off the street who doesn't have mental illness. But there is this huge stigma. And he said, because that person could go out in psychosis and kill somebody.
Hey, Jason
if we could fix it, if we could fix it, I would have limits on how long we could hold somebody in the ER. And I would also ask the Massachusetts State Auditor to audit the hospital units to see if they are releasing people on the weekends, because I think the ERs get backed up because the hospitals don't provide, they don't do programming on weekend. There's no group treatment, there's no therapy. They just kind of wait around till Monday because the hospitals can make more money doing that. So you get a huge backlog of people in the ER. And so I think we need an audit from the state auditor to find out what are your active policies, not what you have on paper, but how many people are you releasing on a weekend? How many people are you admitting to the hospital unit on a weekend. Because if we can clear that backlog, then we can get people out of emergency rooms for faster treatment or evaluation.
I want to ask Jason onto the stage again with us. Jason, thanks for asking to join us again. What's your question or your point you'd like to share?
So there's a lot to unpack on basically what you were talking about, because there's a big difference between, the rights of the community and agency of a person and their personal effects, the right to not be seized under what parameters. I mean, I live in California. I work within California law and I do agriculture law, but I can tell you right now from my experience that California has a lot more leniency, especially when it comes to mental health, because they will release you. They won't keep you. They will give you a slighted evaluation to a degree. And I've heard it from friends. People ask me, hey, can you help my son get out of this mental institution? And I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't do that kind of law. So I only focus on agriculture. But the point is that we're looking, and now we're seeing that what covers under agency versus, privity. Are you being covered under an umbrella that is too vast, too general, that can't adequately ask the right questions? And that's why you're now hearing the words neurodiversity, because confusion of neurodiversity versus mental health are a huge spectrum change. I mean, there's programming that's being constantly released. So if we're looking at mental health as a process, are we processing human beings so they get out of our way and institutionalizing them just like they did in the 70s and 80s and beyond? Or are we actually looking at the community needs? Because let's face it, the reality is when people don't have a purpose to work for, they start developing mental illness. Can anyone tell me on this panel why that the homeless community, after 6 months of being homeless, they're becoming, what do they call it? Indoctrinized of homelessness. They have to be retrained how to live, how to manage affairs, aspects of their life. The government isn't responsible for you to teach you how to thrive. Mm-hmm. That's not their call. But when you don't have the resources to help people navigate through their processor of how they think, what they understand, versus being on medication, because there are people being prescribed meds that don't need it at all. They're just being totally misdiagnosed.
Yeah, I want to pull on that a little bit, Jason. So basically what you're saying is, are we treating people just so that they don't become a perceived problem to us? Or are we treating people to help get them better, to get themselves back up on their feet? I mean, that's sort of the dichotomy that we're looking at here, right? I mean, we've seen it in California.
I would say that, yeah. California, is trying to lead the way. But look at Los Angeles. I was just in LA yesterday, and I'm in Northern California. I live in Stockton, California. And I can tell you, after driving through in downtown LA, there is a homeless population the size of some small towns.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And San Francisco, I used to live in East Bay as well. I mean, San Francisco, even from what I've seen, even more acute. And so much of that is being driven by people's inability to care for themselves, which is why I asked Dan earlier about, at what point is somebody who's sleeping in 5-degree weather a risk of harm to themselves? Hey, Jason, we've got to wrap up.
Thank you for your time. I appreciate for bringing me up the stage.
Joining us on call. That was great. And I've got to just turn the last few points over to you to share your parting thoughts, because we're, believe it or not, coming up on the end of our time here.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the other things we do need to look at is housing in Massachusetts, but in Boston specifically. There are a lot of people with substance abuse issues and mental health issues that are living on what was Mass and Cass. There were like literally hundreds of people homeless camped out in South Boston. So we do need to look at that, because we are even the everyday person is being priced out of their housing. But we really do need more resources in the community, and we need to set limits on hospitals as well, because they're only there for acute treatment. And so we need to make sure that people are getting what they need. You're allowed to be homeless by choice. You're just not allowed to be a harm to yourself because of your mental illness in the world that I work in. So that is my hope.
And thank you so much for joining us here today. A fascinating conversation. And Jason and Frankie, thank you for joining us as well during the course of the conversation. Next week on Sidebar, we have Professor Wendy Murphy, who is a women's rights activist, a law professor, and also a legal commentator. And she's done a lot of research on the Equal Rights Amendment and the legal status of the ERA, as it's called, and now particularly relevant in her view because of the Supreme Court's ruling in Dobbs overruling Roe v. Wade. And there's questions or calls in some quarters about, well, maybe we should just amend the Constitution to create these rights that have been, not perceived in the text of the document by the Supreme Court. And it's going to be a really interesting conversation, I think a relevant conversation. But for today's conversation, my deepest thanks to you, Anne, for joining us here today. And that is going to wrap up this edition of Sidebar. I'm Judge Dan Winslow. Thanks for joining us today. Do justice.